Next talk is by Adam, who is the CTO of Affinidi. Affinidi is one of our gold sponsors. His talk will be more on decentralized to protect. Start your shift away from centralized storage today.
Thank you for the introduction, and hello, everybody. And thank you for joining me for this session for React India 2024. My name is Adam Larter. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Affinidi, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about some of the cool innovations that we're working on here at Affinidi, some of the products, the services, and the tools specifically for developers, but also for businesses to make it easy to change the way you think about handling customer data. Now, as you just heard, I had the pleasure of speaking at the conference last year, and I'm very happy to be invited back. And especially because I want to talk about this really important topic, that shifting away from centralized storage of customer data and really rethinking how we design systems to take advantage of decentralized technologies and ultimately give control of customer data back to its rightful owner, the customer themselves. So today, I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face by continuing to use these old practices, these old architectures of storing customer data centrally, and instead think about new ways that we can address this and how you can get started today. So if you think about the traditional model of centralized user data storage, it really is setting you up for failure as a system designer, as a developer. Because not only are we basically creating a massive honeypot ripe for attack when we store our customer data centrally, but also these centralized systems really don't provide the right hooks for data privacy and fine-grained consent that our customers demand today. Now, there obviously have been some advances on this front. This is a very important topic, and there are best practices that are around now, like shifting left for security and compliance, or there are robust mechanisms for authentication and authorization that you can use now, and threat modeling and prevention and detection controls are very well established. But the user information is still being collected and hoarded in these central databases. We've put all these controls around that central database, but we're still hoarding the data in one central location. And this really does become a very attractive attack vector for threat actors. It's a massive problem. It's reported almost daily around the world. I'm sure you've heard of some of the stories about financial institutions or medical providers or insurance agencies and e-retailers and even online ticket sellers that are being breached. And what the outcome of that is that the customer data is being lost and their privacy is being breached as well. So we need to do something about this. What are the risks if we don't? If you look at some of these numbers, the average cost of a data breach in 2023 was $4.45 million. And 60% of businesses will close down within 6 months after a data breach if they're a small business. You don't want to be responsible for that if you're a developer. That's not something that you want to take on. So the size of these breaches can be really shocking, of the data breaches, but also so can the fines. You look at the GDPR fine for 20 million euro if followed up after a data breach. That's a significant amount of money. Now, there are some other standards, not just GDPR, but I'm sure everyone on the call here has probably heard of the India DPDA, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, that's also evolving. And you're likely familiar with it, but it's evolving into talking more about consent management as well. So there's a lot of movement in this area. It's a very important area that we have to address. Now, the obvious thing that we could do is basically lock our data up and not let anybody see the data. But that's just not realistic and it's not useful. We need to be able to share the data from the consumer to a website or an application in such a way that the data is secure, privacy is preserved, and it's shared completely with the consent of the data owner themselves, the consumer themselves. So we need to find new ways of managing this data flow. And that's what here at Affinidi, that's what we're working on. We're here to change data ownership for good, to put the consumer back in control of their data and also of their digital identity, and to put privacy and consent at the forefront of everything that we do. Now, Affinidi is a startup that's based out of Singapore, but we have offices all over the world, including in Bangalore, where I was 2 weeks ago, as I mentioned. And we've been using decentralized technologies for the past few years to solve real-world problems, such as during the pandemic, Affinidi technology was used to verify the vaccination status of millions of cross-border travelers. And we make use of open standards such as verifiable credentials, which are cryptographically verifiable claims about an identity. We use those open standards to build decentralized systems that put the control of the customer data back in their hands. So we want to do better. We want to stop storing data centrally and taking these huge risks with the customer data. And we want to give that control back to the consumer. So that sounds really great. But how do we actually do that? How do we use decentralized technologies to protect our customer data? Well, first, let's talk about the state of the art for when you're building systems today. If you think about a traditional website, probably more traditionally, it's been a monolithic database and a monolithic application, but probably a more contemporary view of the architecture is microservices. And so you see here, we have a microservices architecture with a single page web application, obviously using React. It's basically all the data is stored on the back end. Now, it's okay for things like the product inventory and sales inventory and things like that, but you'll also notice that the user database is also stored in the back end, which means that it is, again, a centralized data store of potentially personally identifiable information. Now, if what we actually want to do, though, is we want to address that, because if you think about it, there's a couple of issues with this design. First of all, as I've already mentioned, it's a massive honeypot, and so threat actors will want to target that. But also, the consumer themselves don't own the data. So the data is being passed on to the website holds that data, the consumer is no longer in control. In fact, I'm sure that you're building systems today, or you as a consumer have used systems where you agree to the terms and conditions when you first sign up an account, and then after that, you have no idea what happens to the data. So the consent that you've given to the website is very coarse-grained. It's not like you're consenting to giving out every piece of information and that you're kept fully informed of exactly what's going on at every step. So it's not a great architecture. What we really want to do is we want to be really bold, and we want to take that user database and move it to the front end, move it to the control of the consumer themselves. So move it at edge. So imagine a personal data store that runs at edge in the control of the consumer, that and it runs at edge, but yes, of course, there are things like backup and cross-device sync and all that sort of stuff to protect the data. But the main point is that the data is no longer stored at the back end in a centralized database. It's moved to the front end. Now, this sounds really, really cool. It also sounds, well, how would we actually make that work? There is good outcomes here, of course, because you've got control. The consumer has the control of the data, and it also improves some of the issues around trust and regulatory concerns about storing personally identifiable information. But how realistic is it for us to build something like this? This sounds like a real ideal. Moving from this idea of where individuals sign into a central server and store the data in that database, and instead moving to a decentralized model where the consumers themselves are basically presenting an API. And instead of them logging onto the website logs onto them. This is a real shift in the way that we would design systems. So we need some way to make this a reality. This is our perfect state. But how do we actually turn this into a real system design? Well, this is where the Affinidi IOTA framework comes in. The Affinidi IOTA framework is an end-to-end implementation of the OpenID for VP standard. It is actually a standard for managing consent in a data exchange in a seamless way. So the Affinidi IOTA framework, you could think of it like this. Instead of in a traditional system where you store the data centrally and then you run a query on that data, instead you store the data remotely at edge and you send the query to where the data is. So we've turned this model on its head. It really is revolutionary. So you can think of the IOTA framework as a very small query that runs in the context of the consumer's personal data store. Now, in the context of the personal data store means for Affinidi, running inside the Affinidi Vault. So the Affinidi IOTA framework and the Affinidi Vaults and Affinidi Login, all of these tools work together to create a seamless, privacy-preserving experience for the consumer. So coming back to this diagram, in order to make this work, we would migrate across to using the Affinidi IOTA framework. And what does that mean for you as a developer? Well, there's a couple of small changes that you would need to make. In your website, in your web page, your single page app, you would initialize the Affinidi IOTA framework at the start of the application. And then at any time in the life cycle of the application, anywhere in the page that you need data, rather than querying your backend, you simply query the front end using the Affinidi IOTA framework. What that will do, as you'll see in a moment, that will trigger a request on the consumer's Affinidi Vault. The Affinidi Vault is the personal data store and digital wallet together, managing the cryptographic keys. Now, if the user does give consent, then you will receive the data either via a WebSocket on the front end, if you choose, so you can get instant response to the front end, or if you prefer, you'll receive that data via a webhook to the back end. So maybe there's a reason that you actually want to architect your system that way. So you have some choice. Now, what I want to do now is let's put this into reality, because it's as a developer myself, it's always great seeing a presentation, but then you think, well, how does that actually work? Like, what's in it? What do I have to do to make this work? So what I'd like to do is give you a quick demonstration of using some of our developer tooling, the Affinidi command line interface, to actually build a sample application that you can get up and running on your desktop or your laptop within a couple of minutes, and actually start setting breakpoints and hacking away to understand how this works and how you can make use of it. So first of all, I'm going to, using the Affinidi command line interface, I'm going to issue an Affinidi create app. Generate app. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to start a wizard process, and the wizard is going to guide me through step by step. You'll note that I didn't need to read any documentation. That's one of our goals here, is to get developers up and running really, really quickly. We don't, some developers love reading documentation, most don't. If you're like me, you start off hacking and then you go to the documentation when you can't make it work. So we've taken the approach of building this all into the Affinidi command line. So it's a wizard-based approach. I'm creating a new application. Now, the first choice that I have is what authentication provider do I want to use? So we support Auth0 or Affinidi Login. So in this case, I'm going to use Affinidi Login. And once I choose that, I now get to choose the framework that I want to use. Now, there's quite a few of them here. As you can see, you can experiment with .NET, with Flask, with Laravel, and of course, with React.js, which is the one that I'm going to choose today, given that this is the React conf. Now, of course, because I'm using Next.js, I'm going to use the Next Auth package and give it a path to store on my local file system. So I'm just going to call it create React app. And now the application has been pulled in, and it's now situated locally on my file system, but it's not configured. And this is the part where you would normally, let's say you did a Git clone, you pulled in some sample code, and then you would spend the next several hours trying to figure out how to configure the application. So again, we've tried to make this really easy for developers. Built into the tool is automatic configuration. So in this case, it's asking me, do you want me to configure Affinidi Login automatically for you? And the answer to that, of course, is going to be yes. So the tool will query the Affinidi control plane and ask for all of the available Affinidi login configurations. In this case, there aren't any, so I get to choose Create New. And now the tool is going to ask me, what do I want to call it? So I'm going to call it React Conf App 1. And off it goes now. It's making API calls into the Affinidi control plane to completely configure the Affinidi login environment for this particular application. I didn't have to do any other work. Secondly, it's asking me if I want to create a personal access token, which is basically a token that will allow the machine to make API calls on my behalf in my Affinidi account. So I'm just going to accept all the defaults and let that happen. Right, I'm done. So as I would normally do, I will CD into that application folder and bring in the dependencies with an npm install. I'm sure that everybody that's watching this has a lot of experience in pulling in dependencies using npm. There it is, it's done. And now I can simply issue npm run dev, and I'm ready to go. So that literally was just a couple of seconds, and everything is set up in with sensible defaults out of the box in an opinionated way to make this demonstration work. So before we go further and actually look at the sample application, I want to switch across to the Affinidi developer portal. So this is your single pane of glass view of your Affinidi developer account. Now, there's a lot in here. I don't have time to go through everything, but what I'm going to do is just quickly have a look at Affinidi Login. You will see here that the Affinidi Login configuration, the React Conf App 1, has been automatically configured for me with, as I said, sensible defaults ready to go for the sample application. And also, if I switch across to the personal access token, you can see it's created that access token so that my application running on my local machine can make API calls against Affinidi. So now I'm going to go to the sample application itself. So I'll go to localhost 3000, and here it is. Now you can see that it's a very simple application, and it's intentionally simple because we wanted to make it really clear about how everything was working, and we didn't want to confuse things with with user experience and things like that. So it's a very simple application that will allow you to start setting breakpoints and hacking straight away. It can do a few things. So it can issue credentials, which are verifiable attestations of facts that you can issue from the Affinidi control plane. But you can also receive those credentials. So as I mentioned before, with the Affinidi IOTA framework, and you've got the option to use WebSockets, which is what I'm going to choose here. Now, before we go too much further, I want to just talk about the scenario that I want to demonstrate here. I want you to imagine that you are the organizer of a conference and you are wanting to sell merchandise, swag, or maybe some training courses and you want to offer discounts, or maybe there's an after party and only people that have attended at least one session, or maybe it's 5 sessions, it's up to you. Only people that have attended those sessions are allowed to purchase a ticket to the after party. Let's say that's the scenario. Now, how would you do that in a traditional way? If you were storing all your data centrally, you would have all that information in a central database, and then you would let other third-party partners, for example, the training company or the merchandise company or the after-party caterers, whoever they are, you would let them have access to that data. Now, that's not great because you are the custodian of the data that you collected on behalf of your attendees. So giving a third party access, while it's legal, because the terms and conditions probably said that you would do that, the consumers themselves don't really know that's what's going on. And also, again, you have that central repository of consumer data that you need to protect. And what I want to do is think in this in terms of decentralized approach. How could we solve this problem so that we're not giving third parties access to that database? Instead, those third parties can create an application which will ask the user to prove that they attended a session. And if they can prove they attended a session, then they get the discount or they get the ticket to the after party. So that way, my conference website doesn't have to deal with that data exchange. It's all being managed basically by the consumer. Now, in order to make this work, whenever an attendee goes to a session, they really need to be issued a credential that proves that they actually did attend. Now, that is outside of this demonstration. Just assume that that has already happened, but it's very easy to get up and running using the issue credentials option here in this app. I want to focus more here on the data exchange side, on the Affinidi IOTA framework. So imagine I am a consumer. I already have the proof of attendance credential in my vault, and now I'm visiting the after party website and I want to buy a ticket. So in order for that ticket to be purchased, I need to prove that I did attend a session. So I need to present a credential that's been issued to me to prove that I have attended a session. And as the website, I need to have a way of asking the consumer for that credential out of their Affinidi vault and presenting that to me. And that's exactly what you're going to see here. So first of all, I'm going to select an option out of my pre-configured, oh, now my recording has jumped, apologies for that. My pre-configured Affinidi IOTA framework queries that I have created. So I've already pre-configured this, and you can see there it's a conference attendance query, and I'm going to query for that credential. Now, what's going to happen here when I press share is it's going to initiate a data request using the Affinidi IOTA framework. And what that means is I don't, as a developer, don't have to do anything. It's going to oh dear, I'm having a lot of trouble with my playback. Apologies for this. Okay, I'll just let that run. So it's going to initiate the data exchange. And what you'll see is the Affinidi vault will appear automatically, and the user will be prompted to unlock the vault. So in this case, I'm using biometrics to secure my data. So my Affinidi vault is now unlocked, and I will choose my conferences profile where I have an attendance verifiable credential. And if I consent to sharing that data, as you'll see, will automatically be shared with the website via WebSockets instantly. And you can see there is the data that's come from that credential. So in this particular use case, in just a couple of lines of code, which I'm going to show you in a second, the after party website or the merchandise website can easily request data from the consumer directly and not go to the conference organizer to ask for that data, which would, of course, be a concern about storing centralized data. So there's a few things going on there. but you can hopefully see how you could use this same technique for your particular use case. You saw how very quickly I was able to use the Affinidi CLI to choose the framework. Of course, I would choose Next.js. Is then automatically fully configured against the Affinidi control plane with sensible defaults ready to run and start setting breakpoints. What I did previously, though, was I configured my Affinidi IOTA framework request using a command language called the presentation exchange format. There's a lot of information about that in our documentation. Don't worry, it's fairly easy, but it allows you to set up a query that you can run against the consumer's vault, and everything else is completely automatic after that. So the level of effort for you to integrate Affinidi IOTA framework with your application is just literally a couple of lines of code. So you see here, we start off with an import, and I'm sure you're very familiar with importing libraries. So in this case, we're importing the Affinidi TDK. That's our Trust Developer Kit. Secondly, at the page start, you initialize the library, and it's basically just a couple of lines of code. And then at any point during the lifecycle of your application, anytime you want data from the consumer and the Affinidi Vault, you issue a prepare request with the query ID that's come from the Affinidi IOTA framework setup panel, and the data flow will commence. So it's as simple as that. It literally is just a couple of lines of code to get up and running really, really quickly. I know that was a lot. There was a lot of detail in there. Apologies for my video recording jumping around there, but hopefully you were able to see how quickly and easily you can set up an exchange of data with your consumers. And we're building a lot more here at Affinidi. Our technology stack and our technology portfolio is very, very rich. We are based on open standards, as you've just seen there, using actually the underlying implementation is OID for VP. We also implement OID for VCI for credential issuance, and we also implement DCOM for messaging. A lot of detail that we can go into there if we had more time, but it's very easy to get started. You have tooling like the Affinidi portal, as you saw very quickly, the Affinidi CLI to create sample apps very, very quickly, and also to control your Affinidi account, all from the command line. Lots of documentation, sample code, etc. And all of the heavy lifting is being performed by the Affinidi Trust Developer Kit, the TDK, which is our software developer kit for using all of the Affinidi services. So a lot there to help you build applications that stop centralizing the storage of data and move it to the edge in a much safer way. At Affinidi, we want to build a world where everyone can securely and effortlessly control and manage and also extract value from their data. A very important point there as well. And I wish I could go into a lot more detail, but unfortunately we are right out of time. It was really great speaking to you today about this. But the good news is if you want some more information, you can easily find more information about what we're building here at Affinidi. If you're attending the conference in person, please do check out our hands-on workshop on the 17th of October and get hands-on with the same tooling that I just showed you here. The solutions architecture team will be there in person to help everyone use those tools. But as you can see, it is very, very simple. And you'll learn how to master decentralized user profiles with the Affinidi technology stack. And on October 18, we have a lightning talk on the main stage. And of course, throughout the conference, we have our booth, which is the best place to go and ask really deep technical questions. We have our solutions architecture team there ready to answer your questions and talk to you about the applications that you may want to build on the Affinidi technology. Our tech team are always there to help you get started. And of course, if you go to the booth, there will be giveaways because everyone loves some swag. If you want to know more about Affinidi and what we are building here to change data ownership for good, you can also visit our website at affinidi.com and jump into the developer documentation if you're that way inclined. Otherwise, jump straight onto our Affinidi portal and get started in creating your applications just as you saw today. And there's a lot of documentation there. There's a lot of tutorials and tools that you can start using at your own pace. Lots and lots of information there, but do reach out to us. If you get stuck, our support team is ready to help. And with that, I've come to the end of this very brief session. I would love you to stay in touch with us through webinars and in-person meetups that we're running all the time, all around the world, especially in India. And get in touch with us and tell us what you plan building with this awesome technology. We'd really love to hear about it. Thank you for listening, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.